Zan? All right. I would say a couple things off of what Zan was saying, though. Working on this project is probably going to be one of the most valuable ways to prepare for the interview. I know that there's probably a lot of concepts that you sort of like, I'm not sure how comfortable I am with it. And I would say try to implement them, try to use those concepts at some point during this project phase. A lot of times when even when I was at Hack Reactor, there were things that I wasn't as comfortable with, but once I was able to dive in on a project that was sizable enough, I became a lot more comfortable. So definitely that. And then also the fun functions videos are fantastic. So if you are curious about functional programming and JavaScript in general, those videos are excellent. So today we are going to dive into MVC. So MVC stands for Model View Controller. We'll go into exactly what each of those terms means, but in practice, it is a idea that you're going to use to a degree in your programs to implement a structure for your app overall. It's often used to discuss software architecture as well as frameworks. So in a very general sense, the software architecture would be like, this is, how we want to set it up. And then there are also lots of JavaScript frameworks, which are libraries that implement that software architecture. So you probably have heard of a few of these: Angular, Backbone, Ember, React. All of those are MVCs to varying degrees, and they sort of implement this software architecture in practice. So in a really kind of top level here, we've got our model, which manages the program state, our view, which presents the state to the user, and then the controller receives input from the user. And this is just a basic image kind of lifted from Wikipedia that shows you kind of how that works. So the model updates the view. The view is what the user sees. And then when the user interacts with the view, they're actually interacting with the controller, which then sends that information back to the model, and then circle of life. So the model here is where the domain/business logic occurs. And this is where you're going to perform any of your app logic that you need to take care of. So if the user sends you some information and you need to do something with that information, this is where you would do it at. So if they send you a search request, then the model is where you're actually going to go through and look through your database for whatever specific bit of information. This is where you would have your data as far as your objects from JSON. If you're going to do your API requests, this is where you're going to do your API requests. They're going to occur on the model. Whereas the view here is all that the user sees. So they don't actually see the model. All they see is the view. The view displays information from the model, and it gets updates from the model. But it is on its own just a single DOM node that's visible to the user. In other, the MVC framework idea is not exclusive to web development. It goes way back to the 70s, when the internet was just a tiny idea in someone's brain, and it was in use then. But in web development, your view is going to be the DOM. Specifically, a single view is a single DOM node. And then the controller, which is not as useful for kind of what we need to think about, but it's going to listen for DOM events and then invoke relevant methods on the model. So it's kind of the linkage from when the user does something, sends it over to the model. We don't really need to worry about it as much, because in web development and what you guys are going to be doing, the view is probably going to do a lot of the work of the controller. So, say that you create a function that renders a specific view. That is also probably going to contain the event listeners that are then going to send behavior over to the model. You don't need to worry about having a separate controller and a separate view. In what you guys are going to be doing, it's probably going to be pretty tightly coupled. And then why are we even doing something with all of this messy logic here? So the number one thing that we want to do is separate our concerns. So if we didn't separate out our concerns, we would have our model and our view and our controller. And for us, really just the model and the view all in one big file. And that's going to get messy really quickly. You guys probably have tasted that a little bit as you were going through your projects that were on a smaller scale than what you guys are about to do. And as you skimmed upwards, you'd be like, okay, where is this at? Where is this at? Whereas here you can have your model in a specific place and your view in a specific place. And you know, whenever I do something on this model, that's where that logic is going to be, versus having the model logic mixed in with that view logic. So they use the term spaghetti code, which is something you'll see a lot of times for when things are just sort of messy and not very clear and not broken up into neat sections. And then, yeah, so one example of how you might approach this is you might have each of your models in its own file, and then you might have your views in their own file as well. So if the user does something specific, then you would trigger model behavior. And if that model behavior then needs to create its own new view, then you would invoke a function that's on its own view file. And then it would be really clear to see if you were trying to trace through the logic of your code where each of these things went. So that's just a basic. I'm going to go back to this slide here, just so we can kind of review. So we are not going to be relying on controllers very much. We just really need to focus on the model and the view. So here, the model is where we're going to basically perform all of your heavy lifting of your program. And the view is going to be what the user is going to see. So, and then also for our purposes, that's where we're probably going to attach our event listeners. So, you know, when the user types something in and then we want to send it somewhere, that'll type it in on the view. And then when they send it, the model will process that information, either send it over to an API or do whatever fancy things that you guys want to then do with it. Then it'll get, the model gets the information back from the API and then sends it over to the view. I know it's a little bit complicated. Do you guys have any questions about that? Just the model view controllers in general? Okay. I'm not sure. This might be another one of those situations where people aren't 100% sure what to ask as well, which is totally fine. This is more just a general, hey, this is good information to know. These are ideas that you kind of want to strive for. It's totally acceptable that you are not going to have this perfect separation. And this is more of something that you want to aspire to kind of try to do in your code. I wouldn't, you know, if it's at the point where this is actually slowing you down, trying to keep your model and your view separate, at this stage in the game, that's probably not a good thing. But it is something that you sort of want to be aware of and try to do so that you can kind of separate out the bits of logic throughout your program in a way that's clear.
Hey, Jordan, there are two questions in the chat. First off, Andrew asks, so the view sees the user or shows the user?
The view is the DOM node that the user sees. And it can get updated from the model. And then, so then the view, you know, say, you know, we were doing a simple, a search, you know, the user types in something on the view, it gets sent over to the model. The model then processes the search results and then sends back the new information. Does that make sense? Can I see the?
Yeah, he said it does.
Here, okay. I don't know what's going on. I've lost it.
And I think I kind of want to make a comment off of that. Thing about this makes me realize that I feel like also HTML and CSS can be considered part of your view layer. Like there's JavaScript that has view logic or view that's part of the view. So like jQuery that appends stuff to the page or changes classes, but also the HTML and CSS are the very front of your view layer.
Yeah, that's a great point. And in some of these model view controller frameworks that JavaScript has, that's not as clear as it is in what we're doing right now. but yeah, I think that's definitely a good point to make.
All right. John asked, do you have an example of this in real terms?
We did not. I found a couple of things that we could have maybe used. This is another one of those things where I can't just like spin up a bunch of code like on the fly, because it really is kind of relying on an app. Let's see. I did find one website that I can maybe send you guys where a guy had walked through a model view that he had sort of made. I don't know that it's going to be the most helpful, but it's something fairly basic.
If I was using this in a practical sense, would I be writing all my model logic in a file called model.js, and then would I be writing some of the views in an HTML file or in a separate JS file? Or I mean, this is really basic level stuff. That's actually what my question is kind of, what is the best practice to separate them in real terms, like now as we go and write some code?
Yeah, so this is a little bit difficult because we're also going to talk about sort of breaking things up into different modules tomorrow as well. So this is kind of one of those chicken and egg situations. So the MVC stuff sort of relies on some of the module stuff. But one way that you might do it is you could have all of your models on one file, but more likely what you would do is have separate models. So you might have one model that, sends off information for the API request and then gets it back and processes it for the user. So that might be API fetch model.js. And then you might have another module that then corresponds to some other bit of functionality within the app. So you maybe want to break it up into a few different places. And then realistically, if you are going to, you're going to have your base HTML that's set up. If you are going to then be changing that HTML at points and then adding new things to it, then that would be an instance of creating new views potentially.
Yeah, and I think one example of kind of when we talk about views in some of the applications that you have, it might be when someone clicks on a link, like maybe it directs them to a whole different page. But if you look at single page applications, like let's take Gmail, for example. If you look at the page of Gmail, there's, so on your inbox, there's like actually a list of, I'm looking at my Gmail right now to tell you about what it looks like. There's actually a list of emails that have come in. But then on the left-hand side, there's also your folders, and you can bring down a drop-down menu that has contacts, and then another menu that has tasks. So each of those different menus are like pieces of the page that contain different types of information. Those are each different views that are connected to different models. Like one of those models contains all of the information about your current emails and whether they're read or unread. And another one, like the sidebar that has the Gmail chat, that's a view which connects to a model on the back end that tells you which of your contacts are online and when's the last time that you communicated with this contact or this contact. Does that example make sense?
Yeah, and I think too, as you can see, like Gmail is a fairly complicated application, right? There's a lot of different working parts there, and it's incredibly useful to have that separation of concerns between the model and the view so that you can kind of keep everything straight, as well as just, the way that they can even, consistently develop across the board as they're using it. Whereas if you're using a really small scale application, it may be harder to think about how you're going to break your models and your views up. Try to do it if you can, at least a little bit, but it's not something that you want to stress about.
Yeah, I think maybe in terms of your projects, you might even not have a bunch of separate views, but it might just be one thing that's the view logic, so that's doing the jQuery that appends to the page or receives user events. And you might have another one, like Jordan was saying, that does your AJAX calls, stores data about, maybe if you're pulling data about movies down from IMDb, it it holds on to that and then gives it to the view whenever the view asks for it. Let's see. So is there a simple explanation of having your JS files? Is a simple explanation having your JS file separate from your HTML file? So again, the HTML is part of the view layer, but also because there's JavaScript that's part of the view layer. That would be a simple example, but also not completely correct, because you can have JavaScript that's view logic and JavaScript that's model logic. Let's see.
Yeah, and maybe one way to think about it too is like you guys, when you append something to the DOM, right? A lot of times we're just appending kind of tiny things using jQuery, right? But there are sort of more robust things you could do. You could attach like a div with a lot of different chunks of information on it, and then that div might also have listeners on it. So that code that's attaching that div to the DOM, that would be your view in that situation. I don't know if that helped or confused actually, but
yeah. So I think are there any other specific questions? Let's see. Would a simple real world example be a musical instrument to some extent? What do you mean, Andrew? He said that a musical instrument might be a simple real world example.
I like where his head's at though.
All right. If there aren't any other questions, then I'll go ahead and start giving directions to break off into pairs and work on the projects. I will say we're giving you this so that when you go to write your application, you can have a general sense in the back of your mind about how you're going to architect your application, or really just be conscious about the fact that you are architecting an application. You're not just going to like start coding and be like, when the user does this, then this, and then when the user does this, then this, kind of one after the other. So don't like be stressing about like, oh, is this piece of code view logic, or is this piece of code? Sorry, that was my dog. So yeah, don't stress too much about, oh, is this piece of code view or is this piece of code model? It's more just a general idea to have and be conscious of the fact that you're architecting an application, and it can be written in a way which is clean and readable if you put some thought into it, versus a way which is messy and it's confusing to figure out how things connect. All right, so now we'll dive into talking about projects. Tasha asked if we're going to be working in pairs or larger groups. Yeah, I would like that you work in larger groups, so groups of either 3 or 4. Cool. So like usual, once we leave here, you'll go off and use Slack to organize into groups of 3 or 4. And then I would suggest when you first start out, just have a quick brainstorming session, see what ideas people have, even if they seem like ideas that are impossible for the time frame, throw them out there. And then see, even if you want to work towards one of those impossible ideas, see if there's a piece of that you can realize in the next 3 days. Then once you have an idea of what you want to work on, take another few minutes to say, what is the bare minimum version of this product that we can produce? In software engineering, it's called the minimum viable product. So you want to aim to have something that works and does the most basic version of what that application could do, and aim to finish that. And then if you finish that in the 3 days, then you can have a separate list of features that you might want to add on, like, hey, we want to improve the styles a little bit, or it might be good to have this piece of information come along as well, or like, oh, maybe they're planning a travel itinerary. It would be helpful for us to also attach a Google map, but even that Google map you might need to decide, is that the central part of the application, or is that a feature that you want to add on later? So have that discussion, and then I will come around to the groups and give you advice on if the project seems doable in 3 days, or what kind of directions it might be helpful to research into if you have questions but you're not sure of how to solve yet. Are there any further questions before I let you all go? Alrighty then. I will let you get to it.